At my daughter's wedding reception, my son-in-law's mother pulled me aside and whispered, "Your daughter has been stealing from my family for months, you naive woman." I smiled sweetly and said, "How interesting, dear." 3 weeks later, I uncovered a truth that would change everything. I'm grateful you're here to listen. Follow my story to the end and let me know where you're reading from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. I had raised Cordelia for 29 years. 29 years of scraped knees and bedtime stories, of high school heartbreaks and college graduations, of quiet pride watching her grow into the accomplished woman she'd become. At 54, I thought I knew my daughter better than anyone in the world. I was wrong about everything. It was a Saturday evening in early October when my world shifted on its axis. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the leaves in our maple trees had turned that brilliant gold that makes New England famous. I was in my kitchen, preparing dinner for what had become our monthly tradition since Cordelia married Thaddeus 6 months ago. Family dinners where we could all catch up and maintain the bonds that marriage sometimes stretches thin. The dining room table was set with my mother's wedding china, the delicate blue roses catching the light from the brass chandelier we'd inherited from my grandmother. Everything should have felt perfect, cozy, and familiar. Instead, there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite identify, like the static electricity that builds before a thunderstorm. Cordelia arrived first, her auburn hair swept into the elegant chignon she favored for work at the law firm. At 29, she had her father's sharp intellect and my stubborn streak, a combination that had served her well in corporate litigation. She wore a charcoal dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. But then again, she and Thaddeus were both pulling in 6-figure salaries. They could afford the finer things. "Something smells incredible, Mom," she said, kissing my cheek. But there was something strained about her smile, something that didn't reach her eyes. "Your favorite," I replied. "Herb-crusted salmon with that wild rice pilaf you used to request for your birthday?" She nodded, but I noticed she was fidgeting with her wedding ring, twisting it around her finger in a nervous habit I remembered from her childhood. Thaddeus should be here soon. He had to stop by his mother's first. Dorothea! Thaddeus's mother was a force of nature, a widow who had built a small real estate empire after her husband's death 15 years ago. She was elegant, sharp-tongued, and had never quite warmed to me despite my best efforts. I suspected she thought I wasn't sophisticated enough for her son's social circle. Thaddeus arrived 20 minutes later, looking harried and slightly pale. At 32, he was still boyishly handsome with sandy brown hair and kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He worked as a financial analyst at one of Boston's most prestigious firms and usually carried himself with quiet confidence. Tonight, he seemed diminished somehow, like a man carrying invisible weight. "Sorry I'm late," he said, hanging his coat in the hallway. "Traffic was brutal coming back from Brookline." "How is your mother?" I asked, noting the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his water glass. "Fine," he said quickly. "Just fine. You know how she gets when she hasn't seen me in a while." But Cordelia was studying her husband's face with the same intensity she brought to cross-examining witnesses. "Thad, you look exhausted. Is everything okay?" "Just work stress," he said, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "The Morrison account has been keeping me up nights." We made stilted conversation through the appetizers. Cordelia talked about a case she was working on, something about corporate fraud that seemed to require a lot of travel to New York. Thaddeus discussed market volatility with the kind of technical detail that usually put me to sleep. But I was watching their body language. The way they sat, slightly angled away from each other. The way Cordelia's responses seemed rehearsed. It was during the main course that everything began to unravel. "So," I said, refilling wine glasses, "how are the plans coming for your anniversary trip? 6 months already. Can you believe it?" Cordelia and Thaddeus exchanged a look that lasted a fraction of a second too long. Actually, Cordelia said carefully, we've decided to postpone that for a while. Postpone it? But you've been planning that trip to Italy for months. Financial priorities have shifted. Thaddeus said stiffly, we're focusing on some investments instead. Investments? I frowned. What kind of investments require you to cancel your anniversary? Another exchanged glance. This time I caught something that might have been panic in Thaddeus's expression. Just some opportunities that came up, Cordelia said smoothly. Real estate, actually. We're looking at some properties. That's wonderful, I said, though something felt off about the entire conversation. Where? Various locations, Cordelia replied vaguely. Nothing concrete yet. The conversation felt like walking through a minefield. Every question I asked seemed to produce the same evasive responses, the same carefully neutral expressions. By the time we reached dessert, I was certain they were hiding something significant. It was as they were preparing to leave that the first real crack appeared in their facade. Thaddeus's phone rang just as they were putting on their coats. He glanced at the screen, and his face went completely white. I need to take this, he mumbled, stepping into my living room. Even from the kitchen, I could hear his side of the conversation. His voice was low and urgent, filled with a kind of desperation I'd never heard from him before. No, I told you. I need mere time. Yes, I understand the situation. Please, just another week. When he returned to the kitchen, both Cordelia and I were staring at him. His hands were visibly shaking now. Everything all right, honey? Cordelia asked, but there was something sharp in her tone. Fine, he said automatically. Just work. But it wasn't work. Work calls don't make a successful financial analyst sound like he's begging for mercy. After they left, I stood in my kitchen, loading the dishwasher and replaying every moment of the evening. The nervous glances, the evasive answers, the phone call that had clearly terrified my son-in-law. Something was very wrong in my daughter's marriage, and every maternal instinct I possessed was screaming at me to find out what. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay in my queen-sized bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering how long I had been blind to whatever was happening in Cordelia's life. The signs had been there, I realized. The expensive clothes when she had mentioned being worried about money a few months back. The canceled plans, the stress that she had attributed to work pressure. The way she had been avoiding our usual mother-daughter lunch dates. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out what. Sleep eluded me that entire weekend. I found myself wandering through my house at odd hours, picking up photographs of Cordelia at various ages, searching her face for clues I might have missed. There was the gap-toothed smile from her first-grade portrait, the defiant chin thrust forward in her high school graduation photo, the radiant joy on her wedding day just 6 months ago. When had that innocent child become someone capable of the deception I had witnessed? Sunday morning, I attended church as I had every week for the past 30 years. But I found no peace in the familiar rituals. Reverend Matthews' sermon about honesty and trust felt like accusations directed specifically at me. How had I failed as a mother? What signs had I ignored? The elderly parishioners who asked about Cordelia's new marriage received vague, cheerful responses while my heart hammered against my ribs. Mrs. Pemberton, who had taught Cordelia piano for 6 years, stopped me after the service. Your daughter looked so thin the last time I saw her, she said with the well-meaning concern of someone who had watched Cordelia grow up. Is she eating enough? These young career women work themselves to death. Thin. Now that she mentioned it, Cordelia had lost weight recently. I had attributed it to the stress of married life and a demanding career. But what if it was something else? What if the strain of maintaining her elaborate deception was literally eating away at her? The investigation began the next Monday. I'm not proud of what I did, but desperation makes people do things they never thought themselves capable of. I started with the obvious places, the digital footprints that people forget they're leaving behind. Cordelia had always been careless with her social media privacy settings, a trait that had worried me when she was younger and now served my purposes perfectly. Her Instagram account told a story of expensive dinners, weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard, designer handbags, and jewelry that should have been far beyond a young lawyer's budget, even a successful one. But it was her LinkedIn profile that provided the first real clue. 3 weeks ago, she had updated her employment status. She was no longer working at Matthews Burke and Associates. Instead, her profile simply said, freelance legal consultant. Freelance? She had never mentioned leaving the firm. In fact, she'd been talking about a promotion just last month. I remembered the conversation clearly now. We'd been having lunch at that little cafe she liked near her office, and she had been animated, excited about the possibility of making junior partner within 2 years. She had ordered the most expensive item on the menu, insisting that she wanted to celebrate early. I scrolled through her older posts, looking for clues I had missed. There were the usual professional updates, shared articles about corporate law, congratulatory messages to colleagues. But looking at them now with suspicious eyes, I noticed something odd. The posts had become less frequent over the past few months, and the ones that remained were oddly generic. Gone were the specific references to cases she was working on, the inside jokes about firm culture, the photos from office parties and team dinners. It was as if she had been gradually erasing her connection to the firm, preparing for a departure she had already decided upon. I called the firm, claiming to be scheduling a meeting with Cordelia. The receptionist's response chilled me to the bone. I'm sorry, but Miss Patterson is no longer with the firm. She left several months ago. Several months. Not weeks, months. May I ask when exactly? I believe it was early July. Would you like me to connect you with someone else? Early July. That was 2 months after the wedding. All this time, while I thought she was working late and traveling for cases, she hadn't been employed at all. The receptionist's voice softened slightly. If you don't mind my asking, are you family? Miss Patterson left quite suddenly, and we never got a chance to say proper goodbyes. Some of us were worried about her. I'm her mother, I heard myself say. Oh, the young woman's voice brightened with genuine warmth. She talked about you often, always so proud of how you raised her on your own after your husband left. She said you were the strongest person she knew. My throat constricted. Cordelia had been proud of me, had bragged about me to her colleagues. How had that love and respect twisted into this elaborate web of lies? Did she seem troubled when she left? There was a pause. Well, I probably shouldn't say, but since you're her mother, she'd been making some unusual mistakes in the months before she left. Missing deadlines, filing incorrect documents. Mr. Matthews was getting quite frustrated with her. We all wondered if something was going on at home. Something had been going on, but not what they had imagined. The mistakes, the missed deadlines, they weren't caused by marital problems. They were the result of whatever scheme she had already become involved in. The distraction of leading a double life. That evening, I drove to Cordelia and Thaddeus's apartment in Cambridge, a sleek, modern building that I had always assumed they could afford on their combined salaries. Now I wasn't so sure about anything. The building was one of those new constructions that had sprouted up all over Cambridge in recent years, all glass and steel and pretensions to luxury. The rent alone probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, and that was before utilities, parking, and the building's amenities fee. Even with 2 professional salaries, it would have been a stretch. Without Cordelia's income, it should have been impossible. I parked across the street and waited, feeling like some sort of suburban spy in my 10-year-old Honda Civic. At 6:30, Thaddeus arrived home, but instead of going inside, he sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes, his head in his hands. Even from across the street, I could see the slump of his shoulders, the way he gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him upright. When he finally got out, he moved like a man walking to his execution. He looked around nervously before entering the building, as if he expected someone to be watching him. The irony wasn't lost on me. Someone was watching him, but not for the reasons he feared. 40 minutes later, Cordelia emerged, but instead of the business attire I expected, she was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than my car payment. Designer jeans, I realized, noting the subtle but expensive stitching, the perfect fit that only comes from high-end tailoring. She moved with confidence, her head high, her stride purposeful. She looked nothing like a woman whose marriage was in crisis. I followed her, my heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and determination. The traffic was light for a Tuesday evening, and I had to be careful not to follow too closely in case she noticed my familiar car. She took the route toward downtown Boston that I had driven countless times when she was younger, back when I would pick her up from her internships and part-time jobs. She parked outside an upscale hotel in the Back Bay, the kind of place where business deals were made over martinis and power lunches. The Langham, I realized, reading the elegant signage. I had been there once, years ago, for a retirement party for my old boss. Even then, I had felt out of place among the marble columns and crystal chandeliers. Cordelia walked through the lobby with the confident stride of someone who belonged there, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors. She didn't hesitate, didn't look around nervously, like someone meeting a lover for an illicit affair. Instead, she moved like a woman going to a business meeting. I waited 10 minutes, then followed her inside. The lobby was even more opulent than I remembered, filled with leather furniture and the quiet murmur of business conversations. Fresh flowers in massive arrangements perfumed the air, and soft piano music played from hidden speakers. It was the kind of place where serious money changed hands, where deals that could make or break companies were negotiated over expensive whiskey. I spotted Cordelia immediately, sitting at the bar with a man I didn't recognize. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with silver hair and an expensive suit. They were sitting close together, their conversation intimate and intense. As I watched from behind a decorative pillar, the man slid an envelope across the table. Cordelia glanced inside, nodded, and slipped it into her purse. Money. He was giving her money. I left before they could see me, my mind racing with possibilities. Was my daughter having an affair? Was she involved in something illegal? The envelope could have been anything, but the secretive nature of the meeting, combined with her lies about her job, painted a picture I didn't want to believe. The next day, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to confront Dorothea, Thaddeus's mother. If anyone knew what was happening in her son's marriage, it would be her. Dorothea lived in an imposing Victorian in Brookline, the kind of house that announced its owner's success from the street. The wrought iron gate, the perfectly manicured garden, the gleaming black shutters against cream-colored clapboard siding, everything spoke of generational wealth and impeccable taste. I had been there only once before, for a stiff and formal dinner party where I had felt completely out of place among her society friends. The neighborhood itself was a testament to old Boston money, tree-lined streets where every house was a historical landmark and every lawn was maintained by professional gardeners. My Honda looked distinctly out of place among the Mercedes and BMWs lining the street. She answered the door herself, dressed in a silk blouse and pearls, despite being at home on a Wednesday afternoon. Her expression when she saw me was politely neutral. but there was something in her eyes that might have been surprise or perhaps relief. "Virginia," she said, her voice carrying that cultured accent that comes from expensive boarding schools and careful breeding. "This is unexpected." "Hello, Dorothea. I was hoping we could talk." She hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking past me to the street, as if checking to see if anyone had observed my arrival. Then she stepped aside to let me in, her movements graceful despite her 68 years. "Of course, please, come in." The interior of her home was exactly what I had expected from our previous encounter. Persian rugs over polished hardwood floors, oil paintings in heavy gold frames, furniture that had probably been in her family for generations. Everything was perfectly arranged, museum quality in its elegance, and completely intimidating to someone like me who shopped at discount furniture stores. We settled in her formal living room, surrounded by antiques and oil paintings that probably cost more than my annual salary. The room smelled faintly of lavender and lemon oil, the sense of wealth and careful maintenance. "Tea?" she offered, but her tone suggested she hoped I would decline. "That would be lovely." As she prepared the tea service with practiced efficiency, I studied her face. Dorothea had the kind of bone structure that aged well, sharp cheekbones and an aristocratic nose that gave her an air of permanent authority. She had never been unkind to me exactly, but there had always been a distance, a sense that she was evaluating me and finding me lacking in the social graces her world required. But today, there was something different about her demeanor, a tension in her shoulders, a slight tremor in her hands as she arranged the delicate china cups that suggested she was not as composed as she appeared. "So," she said, settling into her chair with bone china balanced perfectly on her lap, "what brings you to my home? It's been quite some time since we've spoken privately." Indeed it had. Since the wedding, our conversations had been limited to polite exchanges at family gatherings, the kind of superficial pleasantries that revealed nothing and committed no one to anything. "I'm worried about Cordelia and Thaddeus." Something flickered across her features. So quickly, I almost missed it. Fear? Relief? It was impossible to tell. "Worried how? They seem stressed lately, secretive. I thought perhaps you might know if there were any problems." Dorothea set down her teacup with deliberate precision. "Problems?" "Financial problems, perhaps. Thaddeus seemed very upset about a phone call the other night." The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken knowledge. Finally, Dorothea leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Virginia, there's something you need to know about your daughter." My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" She stood up and walked to an elegant secretary desk in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. "I had hoped it wouldn't come to this," she said, returning to her chair. "I had hoped she would stop on her own, or that Thaddeus would find the courage to confront her." She opened the folder and spread several documents across the coffee table between us. Bank statements, credit card bills, loan applications, and what looked like legal documents. "Your daughter," Dorothea said quietly, "has been systematically stealing from my son for the past 4 months." The words hit me like a physical blow. "That's impossible." "I'm afraid it's not only possible, it's documented." She pointed to the bank statements. Joint accounts that have been emptied. Credit cards opened in his name without his knowledge. A second mortgage on their apartment that Thaddeus never signed for. I stared at the papers, my vision blurring as I tried to process what I was seeing. Transaction after transaction, all authorized by Cordelia. All draining money from accounts that should have required both signatures. "This can't be right," I whispered. "Cordelia wouldn't do this." $47,000, Dorothea said flatly. "That's what she's taken so far. Money that Thaddeus had saved for years. Money that was meant to be their future together. But why? Why would she need so much money? Dorothea's expression was pained. That's what I've been trying to understand. Thaddeus is too ashamed to tell me everything. But from what I've pieced together, she's been living a double life. Expensive clothes, jewelry, trips that she claims are for work, but are really personal vacations. I thought about the Instagram photos, the designer clothes, the canceled anniversary trip that had been replaced by mysterious investments. He knows? He found out 3 weeks ago when their mortgage payment bounced. The bank contacted him about the second mortgage he had supposedly signed for. That's when everything came to light. Then why hasn't he confronted her? Why hasn't he left? Dorothea's composure cracked slightly. Because she's threatened him, told him that if he exposes her, she'll claim he was abusing her, that he forced her to take the money to pay for his gambling debts. Gambling debts? Thaddeus doesn't gamble. Of course he doesn't. But who would believe that when evidence shows money disappearing into casino accounts? Accounts she opened in his name. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. My daughter hadn't just stolen money. She had built an elaborate framework to destroy her husband if he tried to stop her. "There's more," Dorothea said softly. She pulled out a final document, this one bearing the letterhead of a private investigation firm. I hired someone to follow her. The report was thorough and damning. Cordelia had been meeting regularly with a man named Palmer Hendricks, a known con artist who had been arrested twice for insurance fraud. The expensive lifestyle, the mysterious income, the hotel meetings, it all painted a picture of organized deception. "She's been helping him run scams," Dorothea explained, "using her legal knowledge to make them appear legitimate. The money she's been stealing from Thaddeus has been funding their operation." I sat in stunned silence, staring at the evidence of my daughter's crimes spread across the coffee table. This wasn't a marriage in trouble or a young woman making poor choices. This was calculated, systematic fraud. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked finally. "Because I love my son, and because I believe you love your daughter. This has to stop before it destroys them both. What do you want me to do?" Dorothea leaned back in her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 68 years. "I want you to talk to her, woman to woman, mother to mother. Give her a chance to confess and make this right before I take this information to the police. And if she won't listen, then I'll do what I have to do to protect my son." I drove home in a daze, the weight of knowledge sitting like lead in my stomach. My daughter, the little girl who had cried when she accidentally stepped on an ant, had become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of destroying the man she had promised to love and honor. That night, I called Cordelia and asked her to come over for lunch the next day. "Just the two of us," I said. "Mother-daughter time." She agreed, but I could hear wariness in her voice. Perhaps she sensed that the walls were closing in, that the web of why she had spun was beginning to unravel. Friday afternoon arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly. I had spent the morning preparing Cordelia's favorite meal from childhood, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, hoping that the familiar comfort food might crack the sophisticated facade she had built around herself. She arrived at noon, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and carrying a purse that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. But now I knew where the money for these luxuries was coming from, and it made me sick to my stomach. "This is nice, Mom," she said, settling at my kitchen table with the easy grace she had always possessed. "It feels like forever since we've had time alone together." "It does," I agreed, setting the soup bowls on the table with steady hands despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "We used to do this every week when you were little, remember?" She smiled, and for a moment, she looked like the daughter I remembered. The one who had brought me dandelion bouquets and asked for help with math homework. "I remember everything," she said softly. "You were always there for me, Mom. Even when Dad left, even when things were hard, you never let me down." The irony of her words was like a knife twisting in my heart. How had I failed so completely that this woman, raised with love and values, could become someone capable of such calculated cruelty? We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the familiar ritual of shared meal temporarily pushing aside the terrible knowledge I carried. But finally, I could no longer avoid what I had come here to do. "Cordelia," I said carefully, "is everything all right with you and Thaddeus?" Her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Of course! Why would you ask that? You both seemed tense at dinner the other night. And there was that phone call." "Just work stress," she said quickly, echoing her husband's words. "You know how demanding our careers can be." "Speaking of work, how are things at the firm?" For just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw panic flicker across her features before the smooth composure returned. "Fine," she said. "Busy. Lots of travel lately. That must be difficult, being away from home so much. Does Thaddeus mind?" "He understands. We both have demanding jobs." I set down my spoon and looked directly into her eyes. Those green eyes that had inherited from my mother, eyes that had once been filled with honesty and warmth. "Cordelia," I said quietly, "I know you're not working at Matthews Burke and Associates anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my daughter's face as she processed what I had said, as she calculated how much I knew and how much I was guessing. "I don't know what you mean," she said finally. "I called the firm. They said you left in July." Her composure cracked slightly. "I'm working freelance now. I told you that." "Is that what you call it?" I pulled out my phone and showed her one of the photos I had taken of Dorothea's documents. "Is this freelance work, Cordelia?" She stared at the bank statement showing the unauthorized transfers, her face going progressively paler. When she looked up, the mask was completely gone. What I saw in her eyes was fear, calculation, and something that might have been shame. "Mom, I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain how you stolen nearly $50,000 from your husband? Can you explain why you've opened credit cards in his name, taken out loans he never agreed to?" She was silent, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her spoon. "Can you explain Palmer Hendricks?" At the mention of that name, she flinched as if I had struck her. "How do you know about him?" "Dorothea hired a private investigator. She knows everything, Cordelia. The scams, the fraud, the threats you've made against Thaddeus." My daughter stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, trying to find an angle, a story that would salvage the situation. Finally, she seemed to deflate. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered. "How was it supposed to happen?" She stood up and walked to my kitchen window, staring out at the garden where she had played as a child. "I lost my job in May, not July. I was let go because I had missed too many deadlines, made too many mistakes. I was so ashamed, Mom. I couldn't tell you or Thaddeus that I had failed." "So you decided to steal?" "Not at first. At first, I just used our joint account to keep up appearances while I looked for another position. But the job market is brutal right now, and I kept getting rejected. The money was running out, and I was desperate." She turned back to me, tears streaming down her face. "That's when I met Palmer. He was charming, sophisticated. He said he could help me make quick money to tide us over until I found work." "By running scams?" "By providing legal consultation for investment opportunities." That's how he described it. I didn't realize what it really was until I was already in too deep. "And when you did realize?" Her voice was barely audible. "He had evidence of my involvement. Photos, recordings, documents. He said if I tried to back out, he would make sure I went to prison for fraud." I stared at my daughter, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. She wasn't the calculating criminal I had imagined. She was a frightened woman who had made one terrible decision and then been trapped in a web of increasingly worse choices. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. "Why didn't you ask for help?" "Because I was ashamed. Because I was supposed to be successful, supposed to have my life together. Because I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing you again. Again? Cordelia, you have never disappointed me. She laughed bitterly. Haven't I? The daughter who couldn't keep a job? Who married a man for financial security? Who has been lying to everyone she loves for months? You married Thaddeus for financial security? ... She nodded miserably. I thought if I had a successful husband, if I could maintain the lifestyle I wanted, I could figure out the career part later. But then I lost my job, and the whole house of cards started collapsing. The scope of the deception was staggering, but underneath it all, I could see the scared little girl who had always been so hard on herself, so afraid of not measuring up to some impossible standard. What did Palmer want you to do? Use Thaddeus's investment accounts to legitimize money laundering operations. Make it look like legitimate trading while actually moving money for his criminal clients. And if Thaddeus discovered the truth? Palmer said I should claim that Thaddeus was the real criminal, that he had forced me to cooperate. He had helped me create false evidence, fake gambling accounts in Thaddeus's name, forged documents showing a pattern of abuse. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. My daughter was both victim and perpetrator, trapped in a web partly of her own making and partly spun by a predator who had recognized her vulnerability. Cordelia, I said gently, this has to stop. I know. She was sobbing now, all pretense abandoned. But I don't know how. Palmer says if I back out now, he'll destroy both me and Thaddeus. He'll turn over the evidence to the police and make it look like we were partners. Point 2. What evidence could he possibly have against Thaddeus? He's done nothing wrong. The joint accounts that I've been draining look like they were accessed by both of us. The loans I took out have forged signatures that experts would have trouble distinguishing from the real thing. Palmer is very good at what he does. I sat quietly for a moment, processing everything she had told me. The situation was more complicated than I had imagined, but not hopeless, not if we acted quickly and strategically. There's a way out of this, I said finally. She looked up at me with desperate hope. How? We're going to set a trap. What followed was the most intense week of my life. Working with Dorothea and a team of lawyers she had hired, we developed a plan to catch Palmer Hendricks in the act while simultaneously protecting both Cordelia and Thaddeus from prosecution. The key was the meeting. Palmer had been pressuring Cordelia to set up a final transfer of money from Thaddeus's investment account, a sum large enough to set up their operation permanently. Instead of backing out, Cordelia agreed, but this time, the FBI would be watching. She wore a wire to their meeting at the same Back Bay hotel where I had first seen them together. I sat in a van half a block away, listening as my daughter played the role of willing conspirator while secretly gathering evidence that would destroy the man who had manipulated her. The money will be transferred tomorrow, I heard her say through the static of the recording equipment. Thaddeus will never know it's gone until it's too late. And if he does figure it out, Palmer's voice was smooth, confident. Then we stick to the plan. The gambling debts, the domestic violence claims. I have enough evidence to bury him. Evidence that you helped me create. Evidence that will hold up in court. You've taught me well. There it was. Palmer's confession that he had helped fabricate evidence against Thaddeus. Proof that the gambling debts and abuse claims were constructed lies designed to frame an innocent man. The arrest was swift and decisive. Palmer Hendricks was charged with money laundering, fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other crimes that would likely keep him in prison for the rest of his life. The network of co-conspirators he had built over the years crumbled as investigators seized computers and documents that revealed the scope of his operations. For Cordelia, the consequences were more complicated. She had committed real crimes, stolen real money, participated in actual fraud, But her cooperation with the FBI, combined with evidence of Palmer's manipulation and threats, earned her a plea agreement that avoided prison time in exchange for restitution and community service. The money she had stolen was largely recovered from Palmer's accounts, and what couldn't be returned was covered by the sale of assets he had purchased with stolen funds. Thaddeus's financial life was restored, though the emotional damage would take longer to heal. The hardest part was watching my daughter face the consequences of her choices. The sophisticated, confident woman she had pretended to be was revealed as a facade, and underneath was someone who had to learn how to live with integrity for perhaps the first time in her adult life. Thaddeus, to his credit, stood by her through the legal proceedings. Their marriage was damaged, perhaps irreparably, but he seemed to understand that the woman who had deceived him was also, in many ways, a victim herself. "I don't know if we can get past this," he admitted to me one afternoon, as we sat in my kitchen, sharing coffee and the tentative beginning of honest conversation. "But I know I have to try. The woman I married is still in there somewhere, under all the lies and fear." 6 months later, Cordelia was working as a paralegal at a small nonprofit law firm, making a fraction of what she had earned before, but doing work that actually mattered. She and Thaddeus were in counseling, taking things day by day, trying to rebuild trust from the ground up. "I don't know if he'll ever forgive me," she told me one evening as we walked through the same garden where she had played as a child. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself." "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened," I said. "It's about choosing to build something new in spite of what happened." She nodded, but I could see the pain still fresh in her eyes. "I almost destroyed everything that mattered to me." "But you didn't. When it came down to it, you chose to do the right thing." "Only because I got caught." "Maybe, but also because somewhere inside you are still the daughter I raised, the one who cried when she stepped on that ant." We walked in comfortable silence for a while, surrounded by the same oak trees that had sheltered her childhood games. The woman walking beside me was different from the one who had sat at my kitchen table 6 months ago, worn down by honesty in a way that made her more real, more human than she had been in years. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with dramatic confrontations or public revelations, but with the quiet courage to face uncomfortable truths about the people we love. I learned that even at 54, it's not too late to save your child from the consequences of their worst choices. And sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't anger or accusation, but the simple willingness to see past the lies to the frightened person underneath. I didn't destroy Palmer Hendricks. The law did that. I didn't save Cordelia. She had to choose to save herself. But I gave her the opportunity to make that choice, and sometimes that's all a mother can do. In the end, I discovered that love isn't about protecting people from their mistakes. It's about standing with them as they face the consequences and helping them find a way to become better than they were before. Now I'm curious about you. What would you have done if you discovered your child had been living such an elaborate lie? Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and doing what was right? Share your thoughts below and let me know what city you're reading from so I can see how far this story has traveled. Thank you for staying with me until the end.